As I mentioned a few weeks ago, my family this summer took a road trip for vacation. We went a long ways. We actually drove to Mexico, which I know is crazy, but we did it anyway. And so 26 hours one way. Along the way, we went through Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona before we got to this spot. And it was a little crazy. We actually have done these drives a lot. We enjoy this, but it is long. It is long. Now, here's the interesting thing about a road trip. Like, it's vacation, right? I mean, you're on vacation, but it's not exactly vacation. Like, I mean, when you're driving through western Kansas, it's kind of hard to feel like that's vacation. Sorry to my Kansas friends here today. You can boo. That's okay. But like I mean, you're like, hey, look at that. I saw, cattle. Ooh, that's exciting. It's just sometimes it's like, oh, I'm on this vacation, but it's the journey, but it's not really the vacation. The journey is part of it, but it's not the. So like when we're driving, I'm thinking of the ocean. I'm thinking of sandy beaches. I'm thinking of beautiful weather. I'm thinking of not having any responsibilities for a week. I'm thinking of vacation. And that's what I'm thinking about. The journey is what it takes to get there. Sometimes the journey, when you've got a big family, sometimes it's filled with grumbling and complaining and whining and emotional outbursts. It happens. But the challenge is to see the journey as more than something that simply must be endured. The challenge is to see the journey as more than just waiting. Now, I share that example because I'm wondering if today you've ever felt like in your life you were on a road trip. Like you're not at the destination, you're not where you want to be, you're just waiting. You're waiting for life to change, for life to be different. I suppose this aptly describes the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers is really, in this series, it's about waiting. This new series we're going to be in for quite some time, it's about waiting. The book of Numbers is about the Israelites who have been saved out of Egypt. They've gone through the Red Sea. They've gone to Sinai and got the law. And now they're about to spend 40 years in the wilderness. They're living in the in-between. They've been saved out of Egypt, but they haven't arrived at the promised land, their future home. And so the book of Numbers is really interesting, only in that it's really about nothing. It's about the waiting. It's about that period in between. 40 years of waiting, 40 years of struggle, 40 years without results, 40 years of feeling without purpose. Not in Egypt, not yet in the promised land. They were in the wilderness. And in fact, if you were to look at the Hebrew language or the Hebrew Bible, the title of this is not Numbers, which comes not because they love to count, well, kind of, because it's about two censuses. There's two censuses that happen here. And that's why we named it Numbers. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's named In the Wilderness. That's the name of this. And so as Adrian Reynolds, the commentator, says, the wilderness is the Bible's nowhere place. It's not a place in which we live or flourish. It's simply a place you pass through from one setting to another. Can you relate to that? Like maybe you're in this phase of life and you think, will my kids ever sleep? Will they ever get out of diapers, right? Like it's this I am in the wilderness part. Maybe it's your job. Will my career ever take off? Am I just stuck here? It's your marriage. I'm married, but will my marriage ever be good? Or your dreams. Maybe you're like, this is not what I dreamed of when I was younger. When will life be what I wanted? If you're saying, God's leading me somewhere, but I'm not there yet, Numbers is for you. If you feel like your life is a waiting room, enduring a season, the book of Numbers is for you. If you're starting to grumble and complain a little bit, the book of Numbers is for you. So in this series, we're going to explore this journey through the wilderness together. And so here's what I want to do today. I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to give you a general overview of the book. We're launching here on Labor Day weekend, and I'm going to give you just kind of an overview of how this book is put together and what it's like. Then we're going to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, because we need to see how the Apostle Paul applied the book of Numbers to a New Testament Christian, and this will form really our background for application for this whole process. So that's why I'm having you turn to 1 Corinthians rather than the book of Numbers, because Paul is going to essentially write a letter about Numbers, and we're going to see what he did. So first of all, let's just jump into this overview and talk through the book, and then we're going to jump into 1 Corinthians. So what is the book of Numbers? Well, the book of Numbers, in the whole story of the Bible, from beginning to end, it's the fourth book in the Bible. It's part of what's called the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch are the first 5 books of the Bible written by Moses. And so here we have this book of Numbers. It's both instruction, like there are commands, do this, don't do this. It's part census. There's long sections of just people and counting tribes. And then there's all this narrative sections, which tell stories, which we can relate to and are interesting. So it's kind of all these different genres packed into one book. It covers 40 years in the wilderness. After the Red Sea and Mount Sinai, it's after that, but it's before the Promised Land. And so really the book of Numbers is fascinating because if you flip to it barely has an introduction. I mean, it just sort of assumes that you know what's been happening before it. And it barely has a conclusion. It just sort of stops. It's like Numbers really has a hard time just standing on its own. And that's why today I've titled this sermon, A Journey Without a Beginning or an End. Because the book of Numbers is all about a journey, but you can't know where it came from unless you read all the things around it. The book of Numbers begins with a census, and it ends with this obscure passage about the rights of women to own and maintain property, to keep it in the clan. It picks up the story in the second year after they left Egypt. So it's not even the first year. It's not like, okay, here's the beginning. No, it's the second year after they leave Egypt. It begins with that. And it ends with them knocking on the door of the Promised Land, but not going in. It's kind of like no beginning. No, it's just here. And it's so apt for describing what we're going to talk about in the book of Numbers. It's a journey in the wilderness. Now, the author was Moses, but certainly I believe he's got a team of people that are helping him, who are compiling his writings soon after his death probably, and are putting them together in an order that makes sense in their culture. But Moses is clearly, I think, as church tradition would say, the author of the book of Numbers. I think that there are 2 real themes in the book of Numbers. There's a lot of different themes, but there's these 2 themes. One I've already touched on, this journey in the wilderness. 40 years of wandering. Over 2 generations, because one generation came out of Egypt, but they're waiting for that generation to die because a new generation is going to take them into the Promised Land. So it's 40 years of wandering. It's a journey without departure or arrival. And from time to time in this journey, you and I are going to see ourselves. We're going to find ourselves in this same place, wondering how we got where we are and wondering if we'll ever arrive where we're going. So there's this theme, but there's a secondary theme that comes up a lot of rebellion against God. There are 11 rebellions in the book of Numbers. People grumbling against God, complaining, saying, God, we're done with you. We're going back to Egypt. God, we don't like your appointed leader. There's 11 rebellions. This time in the wilderness is just chocked full of rebellions against God. And there are examples here for us, mostly negative examples. Don't be like this. But it's a repeated theme, and we should heed that. Now, how is the book of Numbers put together? This is a little bit of a head scratcher. Because scholars for thousands of years have been trying to make sense of how this is structured. Most come to this understanding of that it's structured around their journey. So they start at Sinai, that's a section. They end up at Kadesh Barnea. If you remember, that's where the spies go into the land, and the 10 of them say, "No, I know God said to do this, but we can't do this." And they rebel against what God tells them. And then we have the last section where they're in Moab on the border, ready to cross over. And so most seem to organize it geographically around this. But I'm not like most. So, like, that's too easy. That's too Western. I mean, that's like, okay, Dave was on vacation. My first journey was from Waukee to Wichita, Kansas. And my second journey stage was Wichita, Kansas to Phoenix, Arizona. And the third phase from Phoenix into Mexico. Okay, so great. What does that tell you? I don't know, not much. It tells you where I went. Numbers has something more here for us. Numbers has a spiritual meaning and intent for us. Moses is trying to tell us something more about that than where they went and what they did. He's trying to tell. And so what we're going to see is if you follow the spiritual temperature of the book of Numbers, we are going to see this first census right at the beginning with all this hope of coming to the promised land, and you are going to see a spiritual decline all the way to a low point in chapter 26, where the second generation, the second census takes place. And now we see a new generation, and we see the spiritual temperature of the people rise in godliness and desire until they're ready to go take hold of the promise that God has given them. And so really, up till about Christmas, we're going to be in a period, it's going to be really exciting, just a period of spiritual decline. And it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And then after Christmas, we'll come back, and we'll catch the last little bit. And we're going to see the spiritual temperature of the people rise. And so that's where we're at in this. Now, I need you to know, if there's like one phrase, I always try to give you one thing. If there's a phrase that would describe the whole book of Numbers, here it is. You'd have thought I would have put it on the screen, but I didn't. So here we go. You'll just have to listen. Jesus is with you on the journey in the wilderness. He's with you in the waiting. Jesus is with you on your journey in the wilderness. He's with you in the waiting. Now, you all look smart. So you're going to say, "Hey, Dave, why is Jesus in your description of the book of Numbers?" Because, like, Jesus isn't in Numbers. Like, this is 1,400 years before Jesus. Like, what is going on, Dave? Well, good. I'm glad you asked that question. Thank you. Rather, like, how do we get to Jesus? Well, as a Christian reading the book of Numbers, we understand what Jesus said when he said, "All the law and the prophets points to me." So in the book of Numbers, as Christians, we look back and we see this through the lens of Jesus. Now, how do we do that? How do we do that? Well, that's why we're starting in 1 Corinthians 10 today. Because we're going to watch and read Paul's essentially sermon on events in the book of Numbers and watch how he sees Jesus here, which will form the template for everything we're going to do. And if you are not here this week, then you're never going to understand this. So I'm sorry, you missed. You all have to explain it to them. Okay, so let's dive into 1 Corinthians, and I just want to ask this question. How should Christians read the book of Numbers? How should we do it? Because sometimes as Christians, it's a struggle to know what to do with the Old Testament. We are tempted to just spiritualize it. We go, well, okay, I'll insert a random interpretation about whatever I'm feeling for the day. Like, we spiritualize it. Or we're tempted to just ignore it. We go, oh, look at that. I have no idea what to do with that. The ground opened up and swallowed people. I'm sure glad God doesn't do that today. Let's just ignore that. Or we tend to legalize it and say, these are rules for us. And everybody around me must follow these rules in the book of Numbers or whatever Old Testament passage. Or we're tempted to formalize it. And here's what this sounds like. Oh, our culture is making the same mistakes these people made. So the bad things that happen to them are going to happen to our culture. That's called a formula. All those ways are bad ways to read the Old Testament. So what we want to do is 1 Corinthians 10, there's a model for us, an application that's pertinent for our lives. And so to introduce this whole series, we're going to think about how we should interpret together the book of Numbers the way Paul does in the New Testament. And so I want you to flip to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and then I have 4 things I'm going to say about this. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I'm just going to read it and talk through it a little bit with me. So bear with me. Paul says to the Christians at the church of Corinth, and this is, 1400-ish years, a little more, after the events in the book of Numbers. Okay, so a long time later. Paul says to the Corinthians, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea." Okay, so he's just referring to the events right before Numbers and in Numbers. So he's saying our fathers, they came out of Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea. The cloud he's referring to is the pillar of cloud that led them by day. He was like, our fathers were like this. Then he says, and they all ate the same spiritual food. He's talking about manna. And they drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. I think he's talking there about when Moses is told to speak to the rock, so water comes out, and instead he strikes the rock. We'll get to that later. So he's referring to these events in the book of Numbers. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. So he's talking about Numbers chapter 26. Numbers chapter 26, the first generation has died off. The next generation is ready to take over. Verse 6, "Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Don't be idolaters, as some of them were." That's Exodus 32. "As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." He's talking there about the golden calf incident. "We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day." He's talking about Numbers chapter 25 there, where the people rebelled against God. They were like, let's do the Moab sex cult stuff. And they got involved in just this horrible stuff, rejecting God and embracing just horrible, awful prostitution. It was just terrible. "We must not," verse 9, "put Christ to the test, as some of them did when they were destroyed by serpents." That's Numbers chapter 21. "Nor grumble, as some of them did when they were destroyed by the destroyer." That's Numbers chapter 11. Now, these things happened to them as an example. He says it again, these are examples for us. "But they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let everyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry." What the Apostle Paul does there is he takes the whole book of Numbers, he finds a bunch of examples from the book of Numbers, and he applies them to Christians at the church of Corinth. And what you and I can do from this is we can learn how to apply the book of Numbers to our lives. So I got 4 things for you here in our time together. How should Christians read the book of Numbers? First of all, you should read the book of Numbers as part of our story. That's how we should read this. When we read the Old Testament, when we read the book of Numbers, when we read about our people, these are our people. These aren't just others. He says right away, "I do not want you to be aware, brothers, that our fathers." So he's saying the people back in the time of Moses, these Jewish leaders, the Israelites from long ago, are actually the fathers of the Corinthians. And when he says all here, he's talking about all, he says all like 5 times in those first 5 verses. He's saying all the house of Israel. Paul is saying these ancient Jews in Moses' time were fathers to the Corinthian Christians. Well, hold on, Dave, because the Jews in Numbers lived 1,400 years before the Corinthian Christians. So these Christians were to view the Jews in Numbers as their fathers? Wait, the church in Corinth didn't even have Jews. It had some Jews in it probably, but vastly these were Gentile Christians. How are their fathers these ancient Jews, their ancestors? Well, and the answer is because of what happens in the gospel. When you come to Jesus Christ and when you place your faith in Jesus Christ, Paul says clearly in other places that you are grafted in. There is one people of God and you are grafted into that. So you're taken, he uses the illustration of a vine, and you're cut off and you're tied and knitted into the vine of God's people. So you were adopted. These fathers are your fathers, he's saying. So Abraham is actually your father. Moses is actually your relative. The Jewish tribal leaders in Numbers are actually your relatives. This is important because Numbers then is our story. It's not just a story that happened to some people long ago. It's not just a random narrative. It's not like reading about the Jamestown colonists. I don't have any relatives that I know in the Jamestown colonists. So I read that story of what happened to them and I think, yeah, that was something that happened to someone. How about this? French Revolution, right? You read about what happened in the French Revolution. I'm not French. Those aren't my people. That's just something random that happened to people. Some terrible things happened to people in the French Revolution. But that's not my story. But the people in Numbers are my story. They're your story. So recently, I did some family tree research, and this is pretty interesting. Actually, after my mom died, we found in the basement boxes of family history that she'd kept with pictures. And I found, I knew about this guy, but this guy is Christian Miller. He was born in 1850 in Bern, Switzerland. And when he was 9 years old, his family immigrated to the United States, eventually landing in northeast Iowa in a little Swiss community in northeast Iowa. In fact, they just kept marrying each other to the point where my mom was 100% Swiss. So I'm 50% Swiss. The Swiss are my people. I've never been to Switzerland. I need to go because those are my people. And so more than that, like when I read about Christian Miller, he built a house that my mom grew up in. It was built in the late 1800s, and that house still stands today. When I read about that, because I remember going there when I was a kid, and we'd spend the night, and we'd be up at Grandma's for the weekend, and like that was the Christian Miller house. So when I read about this guy, I'm like, he's my people. He's my great-great-grandfather, my grandma's grandfather. These are my people. Now, it's interesting, but it's more than just interesting, because if I were to read that he or one of other my relatives was like guilty of making terrible financial decisions, right? Like that's just how he rolled. And I don't know that he did that. I had other ones that did. But I would kind of want to ask, wait a minute, would I fall into that same trap? Would I be making it makes me do some self-evaluation if I read about that. His daughter, Mary, married a man named William, and William Haas was an electrician, a linesman in the early 1900s, and he went out to work on a line, and they said, hey, yeah, the power's off, and the power wasn't off. And he died. Like my grandma was like 6 years old when he died. Irony of ironies is I actually worked for an electrician for a while, right? I survived it, as you can tell. But, here's the thing. You kind of, okay, should I be? Would I make that same mistake? This is my history. These are my people. When you read the book of Numbers, this is not something that happened to some other people. These are your fathers. This is your history. Because if you are a believer in Jesus Christ, you're part of this. They were on a wilderness journey. So if you ever feel stuck waiting for the next phase, You need to understand that you're part of this too. So when he says these fathers and that are brothers, when he says this, he says our fathers, that's how we Christians should read the book of Numbers. We should look back and see our people. That's the first thing I have for you, is that it's part of our story. What's the second way that Christians should read the book of Numbers? Well, it's through the lens of Jesus. In the Old Testament, in general, specifically the book of Numbers, it's not irrelevant. We just don't bury it. Paul tells us that Jesus was actively working in the Old Testament, just as he was actively working in the New. So when we read the Old Testament, we look through the New Testament and see that Christ was there all along. He says this in verse 4. They all drank the same spiritual drink. They drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. That rock was Christ. See, he looks back and says, and Jesus was there. Do we have any Stargazer fans here? Not a show, but like actually looking at the stars? Like you just enjoy it? When I look up at the stars, I got the Big Dipper. That's what I got. That's all I got. That's all I know how to find. I look there, I'm like, I know people say there's really cool things, I don't see any of them. So there's this app on your phone. Like you put it on and it superimposes the night sky on your camera. And so when you look through this app, it shows you when you turn, it draws the lines between all the constellations and you can see them. It's like the coolest thing ever. I love it. Go out in the night sky and look up and I look through my camera and I see, that's the I never saw that before. Look at that. This is how we are to read the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament. We hold the New Testament up and it says, hey, guess what? Jesus is right there. Look. And you read the New Testament and you go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. So when Paul says, he talks about spiritual food. Spiritual food in verse 3, spiritual drink in verse 4, spiritual rock. He's telling us, he's holding up the app, and he's going, look, see Jesus here. He's right here. He's right here. The rock, he said, was Christ. So when we read Numbers, it's not inappropriate for us to look and see Jesus there. Paul helps us with that. All right, the third thing I got for you then is right out of verse 6. We should read this as an example. In verse 6, he says, these things took place as examples. And he says it later on again in verse 11. So that's kind of a big point when he repeats himself. We're tracking with him. And so he says, I got 4 examples for you of things that happened to the Israelites in the book of Numbers that are examples for you. And he gives those to us. First of all, he says, don't be idolaters. Verse 7. He says, don't be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And he says, don't be idolaters. Okay, you have to understand, in Corinth, where Paul's writing, the Corinthian Christians lived in a very pagan Greek world where idol worship was a regular part of society and life. Like it just was everywhere. Like you couldn't go anywhere. And there's this whole big deal in 1 Corinthians 8 about what do we do if you go to the market and you buy a cut of meat, but that meat had been sacrificed to a foreign god, to a false god. Like what do you do with it, to an idol? And so Paul thinks through that with the church of Corinth and talks about loving their brother and caring for them in the way that we handle this food sacrifice to idol. All this is to say is that the temptation for the church of Corinth was to get pulled into idol worship again. And he says, I remember a story of the Israelites that serves as an example to us. Don't get into idolatry. He says, do you remember when Moses was up on the Mount Sinai getting the 10 Commandments, and the people were like, where'd Moses go? He abandoned us. We need a God. Let's, make our own God. So they fashioned the golden calf, and Aaron later says that I just threw the gold in the fire, and poof, out came this calf, which is just hilarious. Anyway, so we get to this point, and they're worshiping a false god as they bow to the golden calf, and then Moses comes down with the words of God in his hand. Paul says, don't be like, that's an example. Don't get pulled into idolatry. The second thing he says then in verse 8 is don't commit sexual immorality. He says, verse 8, we must not indulge in sexual immorality. That's an example. I got an example for you from Numbers 25. 23,000 fell in a single day because the Israelites rejected God wholeheartedly and committed just the worst, awful things. And he says, this is an example for you. Don't do that. Corinth was a bastion of opportunity for sexual immorality. I mean, you were one temple away from a cult prostitute that was part of the pagan religion. As you just went like, hey, hon, I'm off to go have sex with a cult prostitute now. See you later. Like, it's just part of life. And he's saying in this, don't do like your fathers did. Don't do that. We live in a world, man, it's just a bastion of opportunity for us to commit sexual immorality. And he said, don't do that. You're called, you're holy. You're set apart. You're special. Be God, be the people you are. He gives a third example in verse 9. He says, don't test the Lord. Look at verse 9. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. There, he's coming right out of Numbers chapter 21, where the people just accuse God. They're like, God, you brought us out here into the wilderness to starve us and kill us. You did this to us, God. Like they're just pointing their finger. Like it goes terribly. I'm sure the Corinthian Christians were tempted to test him with idolatry. Like, God, we don't actually think you'll take care of us. So, like, we're going to go turn back to these gods that we think, maybe we can control and manipulate so we get taken care of. And Paul says, don't test God this way. Don't accuse him of doing evil. Don't say, God, you and I are going to have words someday. I got things to say to you, God. Eesh. Don't do that. Don't put Christ to the test. The fourth example he gives us in verse 10, don't grumble. The Israelites in Numbers grumbled. And this is probably Numbers chapter 11. Remember, they went out into the wilderness and they didn't have any bread. They didn't have anything. And so God provided manna. It was this bread-like substance that was on the ground every morning. And, eventually they get to the place where they're like, God, we're sick of manna. I mean, like, can we just get some Chinese food takeout? Like, that would be great. They're like, we think that you brought us out here, God, to bore us to death with our bland diet. The very thing you bought us, God, you brought us, gave us. We don't like it anymore. Oh, I don't know about your home, but this feels like dinner at our house sometimes, Like, I don't like the thing you worked hard for, Mom and Dad, to make for me. Do you hear the kids in this, right? They're just complaining about the good things that God had given them. Have you ever thought God hasn't done enough for you? Like the good things you give me, God, aren't enough. Paul says, be careful. Don't do that. So we got these four examples. Don't be idolaters. Don't commit sexual immorality. Don't test the Lord. Don't grumble. Every one of these, Paul says, is an example to us. So as we work our way through Numbers, our forefathers are going to be examples for us. Don't be like that. Therefore, he ends this whole passage in 1 Corinthians 10 with this passage about no temptations overtaking you except as common to man. God's faithful. This whole passage. Well, think about that for the Corinthians. This was about idolatry. You have an opportunity to sexually worship all these pagan gods, and the temptation is strong and real. And he says, I've given you examples as a way of escape. Learn from them. God gives them this opportunity to escape. It's God's gift. Because your family's already made these mistakes. Don't you make them too. So we're working through this together, and we see these 4 points from 1 Corinthians 10 about how should we interpret the book of Numbers. It's part of our story. We see it through Christ. We see these people as examples for us. And the fourth way is we look at Numbers with the hope of the gospel. Look at verse 5 of 1 Corinthians 10. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased. Is that true today? Is God not pleased with you? Just let that settle in for a second. Is that true? With you, God is not pleased. And this is where the hope of the gospel comes to bear. Because, in the goodness of the good news of Christ, you and I know our brokenness. We're very aware of our sinfulness and how we don't measure up. And we go, yeah, I think based on the merit of my actions, God's not going to be pleased with me. And this is what we believe that happens through Christ. When he shed his blood, when his body was torn apart for you and me, he took all the displeasure of God on himself. He took that from us. And what he did is he gave to us all of his righteousness. So because of Jesus, God looks at you and he is pleased with you. You see, we have to look at the book of Numbers through the whole story of the Bible. The people in Numbers were waiting for mercy to come. But in Jesus, mercy has come. And he's always with us. And so we read this through the gospel. And we read this through then in 1 Corinthians 10:13, he's with you in your temptation, giving you hope. No temptation. There is hope because Christ is with you. He's there. He's present. He's really with you in the wilderness. When you are tempted to leave him, he is with you. When you are tempted to falsely accuse him of evil, he is with you. When you're in the wilderness and you're failing to trust him as you should, he's still with you. He is with you in the wilderness when you doubt that the wilderness will ever end. He's still right there with you. All right, so there are two just simple applications of all this that I want to give you today. One, we're going to learn from the example of God's people. As we walk through the entire book of Numbers, we're going to learn from this example. We are inherently rebels. That's just true about every one of us. One generation doesn't necessarily follow the next. That's another hope for us in this. Okay, so think through this with me. Somebody famous, I can't remember who, said we are one generation away from apostasy. We're always one generation away. And I think you and I feel that, right? Especially if you have kids and your kids aren't where that you want them to be with Christ, you're like, man, I just feel that the next generation might drift away. The book of Numbers gives us hope because the opposite happens. One generation sees God and the miracle, they cross the Red Sea, they get the law, and they utterly reject him. But the next generation, their hearts are renewed. They say, God, we trust you. We're ready to walk with you. And I think this gives me great hope. As we're learning from the example in Numbers. The second thing, we're going to learn from God the example. The second thing is in your wilderness, you need to know God is near. So now we're full circle. We started about talking about Numbers. We went to 1 Corinthians and spent time there. And now we're back to where I started with my road trip to Mexico. And wherever you are, whatever wilderness you feel yourself in. What's your wilderness? What's your road trip? What's the thing that you're not there yet? I just need you to know that God was near the Israelites in the wilderness, and he is with you in your wilderness. They had been saved through the Exodus. But yet they weren't yet where they should be. And Adrian Reynolds, the commentator, he says it best. I'm just going to read what he said because I liked it. There is a sense, he says, there is a sense in which the people of Numbers have received the benefits of salvation that God had won for them. But they have yet to enter into the fullness of that. Not surprisingly, this resonates with every New Testament believer because we live between the cross and the return of Jesus. We too live between the times in a wilderness. Dane Ortland says Numbers shows us God's grace in patiently sustaining his grumbling people in the wilderness and bringing them to the border of the promised land, not because of them, but in spite of them. I hope that you and I together, when we see all the failings of the Israelites in the book of Numbers, will read this through the gospel and find great hope as we're working through our wilderness. So where's your wilderness? Where's your period of waiting? Jesus is with you on the journey. He's with you in the waiting. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thanks for what you led the Apostle Paul to do with the book of Numbers. And thank you that we see hope of Jesus as we look back through the lens of Christ to these people. I simply ask that you would bless our journey through the book of Numbers. Today, I know there's someone here who is feeling in the wilderness. Like they just keenly think, man, I don't know how I got here, but I'm not where I want to be. I pray that they would know today that the spiritual rock is Christ, that they are not alone. Pray that they would know the nearness of Jesus the Savior. I pray this in Christ's name.